That was the flamingos singing "I Only Have Eyes for You." Now, I've been going on and on about all the interesting things about flamingo morphology, but actually their behaviors are also quite interesting in a number of ways. So, you might remember at the beginning of the show I mentioned that the birds can be quite hard to get to because they live in such remote and harsh habitats. But there are several areas where they are known to congregate on a fairly regular basis, and these have been places of intense study over the last several decades. So for example, in France there's the Tour du Velay, which is there in an estuary where the water from the sea combines with this huge mouth of a river, and so there's this fantastic wetland area where the birds are getting their saline environment, and also regular fresh water, and so there's quite a lot of different food items available for them. There's the Puente de Piedra in Spain, also the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, the Ron of Kutch, which I mentioned earlier, in India, and then of course zoos. There are flamingos in tons of zoos around the world, in places like Slimbridge Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and also the Philadelphia Zoo, have had quite a lot of research about flamingos. And all these places have been really instrumental in beginning to understand why flamingos do what they do and what certain things mean, and kind of just basic life history information about these birds. Now, one of the things that flamingos are most famous for, other than their pinkness, is the fact that they often stand on one leg. And people have wondered why they do this for quite a long time. And there have been a number of theories over the years, but there were two that really kind of stood out as being the most logical. And one of them was a suggestion that maybe the birds do this in order to reduce muscle fatigue. So if they stand on one for a while, then they keep the other one fresh because they're resting it. So if they need to jump and run away at any given moment, then that fresh leg would be able to come down and move much quicker because it hasn't been tired from standing. Now the other suggestion was that it helps with heat retention. So you know when you're cold and you might cross your arms over your body, well, it's kind of a version of that. So if you tuck your leg up, then you're kind of keeping one bit of you closer to another bit and kind of retaining heat a little bit better. And actually, although these were theories that were just kind of based for a long time on observation, people have done a bit more experimentation, and the most recent research suggests that it's the latter, the heat retention theory, rather than the former, the muscle fatigue theory, that seems to be most logical in this circumstance. So they actually found that birds that had their feet up, they didn't move any faster than when birds were standing on both legs, and they did find that actually the birds were keeping their legs up much more on colder days and for longer periods of time, and that it did seem to improve their temperature, and so it does seem to have to do with heat retention. Interestingly, though, this is actually not the most stable position, although you do see these birds doing this quite a lot, and they look very stable. But whenever the wind starts picking up, they actually can blow over, and they're not very good at dealing with the wind because they are so tall and they're really exposed. And so they'll only do it whenever it is a nice kind of calm day. They don't tend to do it all the time because they don't want to have to battle the wind. Now, interestingly, the laterality of this is important. So whether the birds are standing on their left leg or their right leg, and also when they're standing around, whether it's with one leg up or not, whether they're resting their head on the left side or the right side. And you wouldn't think this would be a very important thing, but whenever anything shows a handedness, so we humans tend to be right-handed, we tend to be dominant on the right, that kind of has some implications. It signals what's going on in the brain because it's associated with the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere of the brain. And so research has shown that flamingos, like humans, have this right side bias, and that possibly by having a bias, this allows a lot more birds to pack in more closely together. And these are birds that congregate in thousands and millions, and so being able to put everyone's head on the same side, and so you're not bumping heads with your neighbor, allows you to stack lots of birds closer together and not fight quite so much. And they do actually find that when birds all have the same handedness, there is much less fighting, and that when you throw in someone who's left side biased, that will kind of alter the situation, alter the mood, and there are more likely to be alterations among the birds. Now, I've talked already quite a lot about feeding, but there are a few things I didn't mention. So Flamingos, as I mentioned earlier, they generally focus on microorganisms, so they filter these things out with their lamellae and their fantastic bills. And when they do this, they may filter up to 20 liters or more of water a day. So 20 liters is what's been found for lesser flamingos, and as I said, these are quite small, so the larger birds probably do quite a lot more. But it's not just the microorganisms that they'll eat. They may actually even eat mud, just pure mud. And researchers first found mud in the stomachs of birds and thought maybe it was an incidental thing that happened while they were nest building or while they were eating. But in fact, they have found birds also that have only mud in their stomach. And it seems like this is something that they can eat if they have to, as they wouldn't want to. Who would want to eat mud? But they are actually potentially able to extract some sort of nutrients out of mud if there's nothing else available to them. And you might think, given how I've said that there are millions of these birds that will pack in together and that their habitats can be quite variable, you might think that there's a problem with having access to enough food, because there would be quite a lot of competition potentially. But actually their prey items replenish themselves very quickly, and this is what allows so many birds to feed together and utilize such vast areas and not run into any problems with the food running out too fast. Because usually they can utilize one area and then hop on to another one, and by the time they've depleted that second one, they can go back to the first because the stock has already replenished itself. Now, in order to leaving suddenly from one habitat to another, the flamingos also will form departure groups to routinely move between feeding and breeding grounds. And when they do this, they might leave and go up to 100 kilometers away per day. So they have these massive flights just on a regular basis every day, because there are certain breeding habitats that they want to use over and over, and there are certain feeding habitats they want to use over and over, and sometimes those aren't in the same place, and so they have to go back and forth. And when they leave a place completely and go maybe from one feeding site to another feeding site when they're not in the breeding season, they can go even farther away, and it might be several hundred kilometers, and they'll just take off and fly all night long. And they've put transmitters on these birds, and that's how they know that they may fly up to 750, 800 kilometers all in one go. Now, because they live in such hot environments, the birds in Africa, for example, and the birds in the Caribbean area, they often tend to focus their eating efforts during the cooler and least windy times of day. And the wind is an issue no matter where these birds are in the world. And actually, because of this, they've been found to forage in groups, probably because they're helping make the water calmer for everyone else around them. So if you've got a bunch of birds that kind of line up together, then they form basically kind of a breakwater, and they keep the wind from pushing up the waves and getting into their eyes and their nostrils as they're feeding, and that helps the feeding efforts go much more smoothly. Now, when they're feeding, flamingos actually can swim, and you don't see this a whole lot when they're in zoos because often the water is not deep enough. But in the wild, you will sometimes see it. And they do have webbed feet like other swimming birds, and so they can swim quite well. And they'll even upend themselves sometimes, the way that geese do, or mallards. But most of the time, they just kind of walk along, and they might have the water up to their shins or their ankles, depending on if you want to be scientific or not. And they might even go all the way up into their belly, and then they'll just stick their heads under, sometimes on the surface of the water, sometimes all the way under, and they'll just filter the water through and get their prey items out. Now, flamingo communication is quite interesting because it's actually been very little studied, despite the fact that flamingos are very vocal birds, so they're incredibly loud, and some of the earliest writings about flamingos remark on what a cacophony these flamingo colonies can have. And that's partly because they just talk and talk and talk all the time, but also because they're so huge, these flocks of birds. And so if each bird is making a little bit of noise, cumulatively you can have quite a huge racket. And I actually have a brief clip here of a greater flamingo individual and some individuals behind it, and so you can hear what they sound like. So that was quite similar to geese probably that you've heard, or some ducks. I actually think sometimes they sound a bit frog-like or even dove-like, depending on what species you're listening to. And like many other birds that live in high densities, these guys can identify individuals by specific and unique vocal signatures, the way that you can recognize your friends and your family because you're familiar with their voices. And this seems to be something that's encoded in the pitch, which is the frequency of the sound, and also to some extent the timing. And that's probably related to the fact that if you've got differences in your vocal cords, then that's going to result in differences in pitch, certainly, and potentially even in timing. And so these morphological variations influence the communication, and so this allows the birds to be able to tell each other apart. And that's quite important if you want to locate your mate, if you want to locate your chick, if you want to locate an ally that you have if you're going to get in a fight. So this is quite important in these flock dynamics. Now, flamingos are probably better known for their visual displays because these can be quite extravagant. So you may have seen online some videos, or you may have been lucky enough to see this live, for instance in a zoo or even in the wild. They do this fantastic thing called marching. And that's when large groups of individuals will move back and forth in this very coordinated way with their heads held high. And so you'll see this big group of them all standing very tall with their heads looking very proud, and they wander off in one direction in quite a purposeful manner, and then all of a sudden they make this zigzag to the left, and then they'll go back to the right, and they just do this back and forth for several minutes at a time. And they tend to do this when they're getting ready for the breeding season. This helps kind of show that everyone's of the same mind, that it's the right time to start breeding. It also seems to help them meet mates, because a lot of birds, they might kind of wander off together in pairs because they've used this time to find someone that they want to mate with. And it's quite a fun thing to see. There are lots of places where you can see this, where the birds are in captivity in large enough flocks that you can see this, see them start to do this together. And it's quite a good show. And if you don't think that you'll ever get a chance to see that in the zoo, it's certainly worth looking online. There are some great videos of it on YouTube. And they do lots of other things, like head flagging, wing salute, where they stick out their wings wide and flash their brilliant red underwings, which is quite dramatic looking, a leg stretch, and all these things they might combine into a nice long routine to kind of show off their interest in breeding and show off that they're quite sexy and able to do all these flexible athletic things. And people think that actually all of these evolved from what's called comfort behaviors. You'll notice we've had a change of venue, and that's because there was a bit of a technical glitch with the camera in the studio. And since I only had a few minutes left of the broadcast, I thought I might finish up here at the University of Exeter. So before the camera stopped functioning, what I was talking about was the fact that flamingos have a variety of behaviors that they use in order to show that they are interested in breeding. And so they have all these very exaggerated sort of performance things that they do. And researchers think that these emerged from what were originally just comfort behaviors. So they're kind of routine things that animals might do to stretch out, or to kind of change their feet so they're a bit more comfortable, shift their weight, preening, for example, or things that you just kind of do in order to make yourself feel a bit more secure. So this is kind of like what we have, for example, in cats that will often clean themselves in order to feel more comfortable and less stressed out. So you have both kind of physical and emotional, if you will, comfort that then becomes translated into these physical things that the flamingos do when they're displaying to each other. Now they also have behaviors that are associated not just with attracting others and making themselves look quite interested in breeding, but also keeping others away and protecting both themselves and their relatives, in particular their young. So for example, like geese, they will hook their necks and walk forward in a very aggressive way to try to scare off anything that comes too close. And flamingos also have this amazing thing called chrysanthemuming, and that's where they erect all of the feathers on their necks and back areas, and those are called their scapulars. So they'll puff these up, and the whole body becomes much larger and looks much more threatening than the skinny little flamingo would on its own. Now, in terms of their actual breeding behaviors, flamingos for a really long time were quite hard to locate and quite hard to study because people just physically couldn't get out to these remote and quite dangerous locations where they were found. And in fact, not until the 1950s was a whole lot known about lesser and greater flamingos. And that was the first time when we had publications of what was going on, and people had studied these birds both in Africa and in the Mediterranean, particularly in the Camargue region of France. And Interestingly, the birds actually have a very narrow environmental range of what they can tolerate when they're breeding. So already we know that they tend to be quite picky when they go back and forth for eating. Well, on top of that, you have to add in the fact that not only are they interested in food when they're breeding, but they're also interested in particular substrate that helps them to create their nests. And specifically, they have to have enough mud that they can create these massive kind of pyramid type shapes that they have, and they just stand and they will scoop all this mud up and they'll build it up slowly and then kind of have a little depression in the top where they can set the egg. And if the mud is there's not enough mud, then they obviously can't build these giant structures. But if the mud is too wet and it's too runny, then again it's not going to adhere and make quite the cone-like structure that they need. And they do need to have a substantial amount there because that will keep their chicks off of the ground. It will keep them away from the salinity and from the water, which are quite hazardous, and it also will keep them in a cooler location than it is out on the ground, exposed to the sun. So it can be several degrees cooler up in the middle of the nest. So it's quite important that they get this right. And rather than build in a place that's not very good, the flamingos would rather just forego breeding altogether and wait until the next season when actually conditions might be a bit more to their liking. Now, during the whole breeding encounter between a male and a female, it's actually quite interesting because the male will kind of follow the female along very closely and indicate that he's interested in having a copulation. And the female will support the full weight of the male. And often the mating event happens in the water because they'll have started off actually just feeding and then progressed to mating. But in the few instances where this has been, well, not that few, but it's not incredibly common for it to happen on land. But when it has, people have observed that the female at this point will hold the entire weight of the male during the entire copulation event, which is pretty impressive considering that the males are generally larger than the female. Pairs sometimes will stay together from one year to the next, and for a long time people thought that flamingos had really high fidelity. But actually it turns out that there is frequently quite a lot of mixing up from one breeding season to the next and over multiple different years. And this is a little bit unusual given how long these birds live, because often you have, when birds are quite, they have quite a lot of longevity, then you see that they tend to stay together with the same partner. But in flamingos this is not the case, and that might have something to do with the fact that they are always moving so much, and so they can't be guaranteed to find their same partner every time they come together in a particular habitat when they're ready to breed. Now, as I said, they scoop the nest out of the mud in this very meticulous pattern, and both of the mates will be involved in that process, and both of the mates are also involved in incubating the egg. The female does tend to do a little bit more, but that's not always the case. And what you tend to have is one staying on for maybe a 12-hour shift while the other goes off and feeds, and then they come back and switch that up. And it's really important that they are quite careful with the egg, because if it rolls off, flamingos don't show behavior where they are able to recognize their egg and get it back into the nest. And so if the egg is lost, then it is never recovered and they have to start breeding all over again. So it is quite important for them to be very careful when they're handling the egg and getting up off of the nest and switching over. The nests that they make are actually really massive. So I mentioned that they can make these quite large, cone-like kind of pyramid type things that keep the babies off of the hot ground. Well, they can be, each one, up to 80 kilograms, and research has shown that they tend to build on the same ones over and over again. So they might come back the next year, and build in the same site. And whether it's the same birds or another pair, they tend to use those previous things as a base on which to add more. And so researchers have found these kind of, in these archaeological digs, they found these really massive compilations of mud where they just have tons and tons of old nests built on top of each other, and they are really, really heavy. And in fact, all of this activity that the flamingos will have cumulatively as a flock can change the hydrology and the geology of an area because it moves such massive amounts of soil around, and it changes the way that water flows. Now, each female only lays one egg at a time, and so they end up having, hopefully, if all goes well, one chick at a time. And the chick is fed something that's called crop milk, and it's not actually milk. It's a substance that's produced by glands at the top of the flamingo's digestive tract, And because it contains a little bit of blood from the parents and also these carotenoid colorations that I talked about before, it tends to look quite red. And so early biologists thought that maybe the flamingos were feeding their chicks pure blood in order to survive, and that's not actually the case. And you'll notice if you look really closely at a flamingo, its bill has a little hook on the end of it, and this seems to be something that has developed to help the flamingos with their giant bills feed their chicks. When their chicks are born, they have little straight bills. They don't have that crooked bill quite yet, and so the tip fits right into that little chick bill and helps the adults funnel the food straight into the chick's stomach. And when chicks get old enough and are mobile, so that's about after a week or so they're able to kind of move around, they tend to form little groups, and these groups are called creches. And it's important that they do this because after a while the adults decide they don't want to have to care for their young anymore, and it's too much work. The young can cope and they can feed for themselves, and so increasingly you'll see the parents not taking care of the young, not feeding them, not wanting to brood them. And so it's important that chicks have these little groups that they can hang out in because this is nice protection for them. So if you no longer have the parent to look over you, it's good to have a whole bunch of other individuals in your cohort that can kind of keep you company, and you can all look out for predators together and basically just improve your safety. And eventually at some point when the chicks do get old enough, they go through the juvenile phase and they become kind of sub-adult, they do join the flock again once they're more adult sized and they're not kind of going to be interpreted as underlings quite so much, and actually adults will run away from their young after a certain point. So once the young are no longer small enough to be run away from and seen as a threat, as an annoyance, they will join up again with the adults. Now, as I mentioned already, flamingos are quite long-lived birds. And basically, once they've survived their first year, they have very good odds of surviving each successive year. As a matter of fact, after you've gotten through your first year, you have a 95% likelihood of surviving each next year. And because of this, we do see quite old flamingos. In the wild, the oldest bird reported was 40 years and 23 days, but in captivity, this can actually be much improved. So right now at Slimbridge, there is a James flamingo that's known to be at least 70 years old. And that's because they knew when it was born in Mexico, and then it was shipped over here several decades ago, and they've had it in captivity ever since. And so they have these very good records showing that this bird is several decades old. And amazingly, these guys will still engage in breeding activities even when they are into their 5th, 6th, 7th decade. Even though they're not usually as successful as the birds that are in their 2nd and 3rd, they are still active. And so this shows that actually they are quite healthy throughout that period. That elderly period, if you liken them to humans. And in fact, the things that are the biggest threats to them are not their own kind of aging bodies, but external factors. So toxins in the water, this is particularly common, as I mentioned earlier. Metals in the water is another problem. The spread of disease, anytime you've got a big flock of animals living together, they're more likely to spread disease to each other. And also predators such as gulls and storks. And actually gulls are known, that the bigger gulls may even come and lift the parents off of their nests as they're incubating in order to get access to the eggs. So gulls can be really pernicious, and marabou storks can be as well. If you've ever seen a documentary of flamingos, you've probably seen the marabou storks terrorizing the poor little birds. Unfortunately, though, the worst threat to flamingos is actually humans. So historically, flamingos were eaten, and in particular, the Romans used to love their tongues, apparently, but this is no longer much of a problem, though there is some poaching of eggs. And recently in India and also in the Middle East, there have been some events, some illegal hunting events of flamingos, and so it looks like maybe this is becoming a bit more popular again. But the real problem is the fact that the birds are sensitive to human traffic. They are particularly sensitive to foot traffic, a little bit so to car traffic, and also to planes. And people will also often hire planes to take them out to these remote breeding sites so they can see the flamingos from above, because it is quite an impressive sight. But unfortunately, if you've got a plane that comes down low in order to see the flamingos while they're roosting, this can often scare them, flush them away, and they might never return. Or when they do go away, you might have predators coming in and stealing their eggs, so they come back to an empty nest. So that's quite dangerous for them, so that it's best for them to be away from humans. But in fact, as bad as that is, actually the worst problem is the degradation and loss of habitat. And this happens because of lots of different reasons, and it depends kind of on the geographical area. So there are mining activities, the siphoning of water for agriculture, the building of roads, and also the erection of power lines. So flamingos are known to fly into power lines because, like other large birds, they tend to be good at flying long distances, but they're not quite as good at maneuvering around in short distances. And so when they get up in the air, they get too close to these wires and they can't adjust fast enough to get away from them. And one of the biggest sites where flamingos are in trouble is Lake Natron in Tanzania. And this is where almost all lesser flamingos are known to breed. And even though they have a really stable population right now, and there are loads of them, millions of these birds, they're in trouble because the lake is under constant threat of having a road built next to it and also having a soda extraction facility erected on it. And if they take out soda from the area, then it's going to change the pH of the water, which will affect how much and what type of food is available. And also if they just adjust how much water is there and where it is going to impact whether the birds even have enough water for anything to grow in to eat, and also enough water to make the mud for their nests. And so this is a real problem of concern. And right now the project is on hold, which is really good, but conservationists are really keeping an eye on this because any activity could single-handedly wipe out pretty much the entire lesser flamingo population in the world outside of zoos. And so actually zoos are an important thing to mention because they have been used for a really long time to try to breed flamingos in captivity and also keep healthy populations alive in order to keep their genes in the gene pool in case they're ever needed for replenishing natural stocks or for replenishing other captive populations of these birds. And one of the really important places where this is being done is Slimbridge, which you guys may have heard of. The WWT up in Slimbridge has a lot of flamingos and has historically had lots of flamingos. And they really pioneered kind of the efforts and how it is you take care of a flamingo in captivity. They figured out a lot of the problems, so making sure they're pink and healthy and not transmitting disease, how to get them to breed with each other in these abnormal conditions. And actually, if you are interested in seeing flamingos, and I definitely recommend going up to Slimbridge because they have a great facility and they know lots and lots about them and can give you lots of information. And it's really fun to see these guys in a habitat that has been made specifically for them to make them as comfortable as possible. And people like Slimbridge and other captive researchers and breeders are really trying to help make sure that flamingos no longer need to be caught from the wild in order to populate zoos, but in fact we could have self-sustaining populations instead that would not only allow people to see them all around the world, but also, as I mentioned earlier, might be used if necessary to try to repopulate certain areas if anything should happen to wild flamingos. And that pretty much summarizes my kind of brief run-through of flamingo biology, and hopefully you have enjoyed that and found that interesting. And on the web I'm going to post some pictures of the flamingos and also some resources in case you're interested in visiting flamingos or donating to flamingo conservation efforts.